Cambridge Analytica is more of a concept or a brand than anything else, because it doesn't actually have employees. It's all SCL. It's just the front-facing company for the United States. But I started at SCL Group in June 2013. In July 2014, that's when I told Alexander Nix that I didn't want to continue working at the time Cambridge Analytica. Although I scaled down my work until the 2014 midterms, so a year and a half. And Cambridge Analytica, just to be clear, was set up in large part because of the research that I was doing at SCL Group. So the IP that we were creating was acquired by Robert Mercer, and Cambridge Analytica became the vehicle to sort of acquire that IP.
Yeah. How would you said that Cambridge Analytica doesn't have any employees, that effectively they're all employed by SCL.
Yeah.
Yeah. How would you characterize the relationship between these different companies? I mean, is it in effect one organization that exists behind different facades?
Yeah, I mean, so Cambridge Analytica was set up in part because, first of all, there was so the way it works is CA was set up, and SCL Elections, which is part of SCL Group, which is a group company. SCL Elections became a minority shareholder, and then Robert Mercer became the majority shareholder of Cambridge Analytica. SCL then assigned its intellectual property to Cambridge Analytica, and then Cambridge Analytica licensed back the IP to SCL Elections. And then also granted SCL Elections an exclusivity contract whereby all projects from Cambridge Analytica would be given to SCL to work on, although the actual contracting on the client-facing side would be with Cambridge Analytica. Partly that was because in the United States there's particular rules against foreign actors in elections, so having an American company was beneficial for that purpose. Also, Robert Mercer's lawyers were concerned about two things. Firstly, the optics of acquiring a UK military contractor to work in American elections. Optically, that wouldn't necessarily play well. And secondly, they were concerned about some of the history of the shareholders in the company, as well as some of the past projects they had worked on.
The company being SCL? In that
SCL,
yeah. So Cambridge Analytica was a kind of a company set up with the purpose of doing political work in America? In
the United States, with a new brand that was sort of untainted by any history or legacy of past projects or shareholders.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people will say, and are saying, that given that you're someone who worked very closely with these people for a period of time and understand this world very well and have built your career working in it, why have you decided to speak out against it and give evidence against people who used to be your colleagues?
Because, as a citizen, one is expected and has a duty to report unlawful activity. If you're asking about sort of my journey to this moment, a lot of people have asked me, why is it taking you so long? What they don't see is that actually I've been working on this with The Guardian and then later the New York Times and Channel 4 for a year. So what you're seeing is sort of the apex or the climax of that. But this is a year-long coming out process. But before going public, I went and started working with the ICO and UK authorities to start their investigation. After I left Cambridge Analytica, very shortly after that, I got threatened with legal action and had, a very aggressive team of lawyers coming after me. So I signed an undertaking of confidentiality, which would mean that if I did break that, I could be sued into oblivion by Robert Mercer. So frankly, that's intimidating. But more broadly, it was only until 2016 when I was working at CA and setting it up. You don't appreciate the future impact of what your work is until it starts to happen. And so 2016 was, where I started looking at what this company was actually doing in the United States, and, coming to appreciate that the projects that I was working on may have had a much wider impact than I initially anticipated it would. And after Donald Trump got inaugurated, very shortly after that, that's when I started working with Carol at The Guardian on reporting some of the things that the company was doing. So for the spring, I was one of her key sources anonymously until we could figure out a legal position that would then allow me to come forward.
So you would be fair to say that for you, Donald Trump's election sort of crossed a line. You felt that techniques that you were aware of had been used, shouldn't have been used in the way they were used during the campaign, and therefore you felt that you had to speak out about it. Would that be a way of characterizing it?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's just because of Donald Trump, but Donald Trump kind of makes it click in your head that this actually has a much wider impact. I don't think that military-style information operations is conducive for any democratic process, whether it's a U.S. presidential or a local council race.
Yeah. Could I just ask as well about the relation when Cambridge Analytica was founded? Who do you think sort of, in terms of how the algorithm, the database that Cambridge Analytica worked from, was that something it inherited from SCL, or was that something that you developed, or was it developed by other people?
SCL. This is partly why I was brought on as research director, because SCL was falling behind in its technical capacity and its quantitative skill set. So it didn't. SCL before I joined did not have any data assets. So that was in large part why I got hired. So it was the Ripon project that actually acquired data and scaled it. It was at that moment where they started becoming more focused on data science and machine learning.
Is it true? I've seen it reported that the name Cambridge Analytica was Steve Bannon's. Is that correct?
Yeah, because it's sort of a bizarre story. So Alexander Nix has his sort of standard pitch, as it were, and it often relies heavily on, we have offices in Mayfair, and I went to Eton, and, presenting a very sort of posh veneer onto the company, which, when you look at their clientele in a lot of the, it's a lot of developing countries in the Commonwealth, and there's still sort of that sort of image, plays well with certain types of clients that he had worked with in the past. Problem was that for Steve Bannon, he didn't really care about that. He was much more interested in, going and speaking at student events at Cambridge than, sitting in a posh office in Mayfair. So Alexander realized that, and he decided to set up a fake office in Cambridge so that whenever Steve Bannon, this is before Steve Bannon came on board to which set up a project which eventually became CA, and so whenever Bannon would come, we set up this fake office, and to sort of present a more academic side of the company. And it was from that Steve Bannon decided we should call it Cambridge Analytica because of how closely associated it was with the university. Because in his head, it was a very academic company. Okay.
And other than that geographical proximity, did the company have any particular relationship with Cambridge University?
It didn't have a formal relationship, but we did work with a lot of professors at the University of Cambridge, in particular the psychology department and the psychometric center.
Okay, so they would do research projects and assist with developing techniques and feeding ideas.
Yeah. We would use the Cambridge has an amazing psychology department. It's one of the top, if not the top, in the world for psychology. So it was a real resource to have that very close to us. So we did work with several professors at the psychology department on developing psychometric inventories and also looking more broadly at the research that was coming out of the university in psychological profiling using online data exhaust. So, a lot of the papers that eventually became the foundation of the methods that were then used on the Ripon project, that all came out of research that was being done at the University of Cambridge, some of which was funded in part by DARPA, for example, which is the US military's research agency.
And did you just approach academics on an ad hoc basis, or was there any engagement with the university authorities or any of the departments?
We definitely talked to some of the more senior professors, but it was all, there was nothing formalized with the university itself. Mm-hmm. So it was all done, professor to professor to professor, but it sort of sat in the gray area. I mean, when Ripon was happening, we had a lot of people who we were engaging at Cambridge who provided, who played a pivotal role in actually getting that project going.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Paul Farrelly.
Thank you, Chair. So essentially your central motivation has been that you're rather aghast that techniques in the social media world that have been used for military psyops purposes are being used in the political domain.
I mean, that's a part of it. I think also more broadly, when you look at how Cambridge Analytica operates or how SCL operates, they don't care whether or not what they do is legal as long as it gets the job done. So it's not there's been a lot of focus on the data side of things, and there's been a lot of focus on targeting, but more broadly this is a company that goes around the world and undermines civic institutions of countries that are struggling to develop those institutions. So there's a lot of reasons why I find the company problematic. It's not just the data. It's also more broadly that they are an example of what modern day colonialism looks like. You have a wealthy company from a developed nation going into an economy or a democracy that's still struggling to get its feet on the ground, and taking advantage of that to profit from that. So there's several reasons why I find the company problematic. So
do they sort of like to have an aura, do you think, of being the schmash of the modern digital age?
The smash?
Schmash. So James Bond, the evil organisation that manipulates things here, there, and everywhere across the world.
I think if you watch the Channel 4 Undercover, for example, I think you can see for yourself that they know that that's the brand that they present, and they cultivate that. I think they find it amusing.
No, I sort of get it, and I didn't quite know what to make of Mr. Nix when he came to us, apart from that he was a corporate financier who sought a higher calling, as he almost said it to us. But I do remember on the Channel 4, one of the most hilarious bits was a chap called Mark Turnbull, who got a big plaster on his nose, I think, saying that he was a master of disguise.
He doesn't always have the plaster on his nose.
Okay. just before we want to get around onto some of the things that happen in different parts of the world, but just before we do, I just wanted to just probe into your predecessor who died in Kenya.
Yeah.
Was that I've not heard of that, working for the Kenyatta campaign?
Yeah.
Were there any suspicious circumstances?
I've heard several different stories as to what actually happened, so I don't know which story is accurate, but it didn't sound. When you work in Kenyan politics or politics in a lot of African countries, if a deal goes wrong, you can pay for it.
So is this a matter of public record, or is this new now?
Dan, who's my predecessor, his death did cause some news coverage in Romania because he was the son of a cabinet minister in Romania who is now in jail for corruption charges, I think. But so he came from a political family in Romania. So the fact that he died was news, but the circumstances of his death, I've heard different stories, so I'm not sure which is.
And his name was Dan?
Dan, his surname starts with an M. And
Muresan.
Yeah,
Muresan.
Could you spell that just for the record?
Muresan.
Okay.
He was working simultaneously in India, I think, and there's also some coverage
simultaneously
from there.
in India?
Yes.
I mean, when you look at Facebook's biggest market, I mentioned this in the States as well. India is the top in terms of numbers of users, and obviously that's a country where, which is rife with political discord and opportunities for destabilization. So that
they've worked extensively in India. They have an office in India.
I think that's something we might want to pursue later. But just on this point, when you were told that there was a vacancy because your predecessor died in Kenya, what explanation did the company give to you of that death?
Just to clarify, when I got hired, I wasn't told that my predecessor died in Kenya in his hotel room. That was several months after, when I asked about who was I actually replacing. Because I was looking for some old files and I couldn't find. So I did realize that I didn't actually know the name of the person who I replaced. So I asked about, looking through old files, and that's where it came out that he died.
So same question 2 months on then. What explanation were you given of the? How old was he? Do you know?
He was in his 30s.
Did they give you an explanation?
I mean, they did. Just if I explain it, just if you understand that it's pure speculation. So It's not. I'm not stating this as a matter of fact. I'm just repeating, what I heard. What I heard was that he was working on some kind of deal of some sort. I'm not sure exactly what kind of deal it is, but when you work for senior politicians in a lot of these countries, you don't actually make money in the electoral work. You make money in the influence brokering, after the fact. And that a deal went sour, and again, this is what I've been told, so I'm not saying this as a matter of fact, but people suspected that he was poisoned in his hotel room. I also heard that the police got bribed to not enter the hotel room for 24 hours. But that is what I was told. I wasn't there, so I can't, speak to the veracity of that account. But that's what I was told. Okay, well, we'll leave that there for the moment because there are plenty of journalists who might want to follow some of those interesting leads. One of the things that as Mr. Nix was at pains to stress when he was in front of us was that there were different companies, different entities. Data could go one way but not another way because of government contracting. But there was one name that came up as the data control that was common between Cambridge Analytica and SCL, just almost demonstrating that there were common personnel, notwithstanding the
the denials was a lady called Jordana Zeta. Do you know her?
I do not.
No.
No.
It's just a name.
It's just a name, but they do put lots of random names on all kinds of things.
Okay. I mean, there's also we've just been. I don't know whether you've seen that, which is a pictogram of the SCL structure. It's
Sure.
been done by an independent journalist, and it's just from filings at Companies House and
Sure.
so it's fairly standard, but it's fairly complicated for a relatively
I'd
small
wager that
company.
there's probably more companies than even what's on that piece of paper.
But there are some interesting sort of names that crop up. Mr. Nix we know about. Sort of Etonian salesman, I think you almost described him as.
I mean, he my understanding is that the reason why Alexander Nix was involved in SCL was because his father had shares in the company and his father died. He inherited shares, or there was some deal that was done, because he has no background in psychology, tech, politics, any of the things that they operate in, which is why he's a salesman. He likes to sell stuff.
And while I was cooking Sunday lunch this weekend, I listened to a BBC profile of Nigel Oakes.
Right.
Did you come across him?
Yes, although not day to day. So when we were setting up Cambridge Analytica, the reason why one of the reasons why SCL Elections, rather than either the group company or another entity, was the minority shareholder, was because Alexander Nix wanted to keep more control for himself, and he was quite paranoid about some of the other shareholders and directors in the group company. So he made a concerted effort to sort of keep this project away from the others as long as possible. But I did come across him several times. It's just what I'm saying is that it wasn't day to day. I didn't work with
Nigel Oakes. Mr. Oakes came across as a founding eminence grise.
Sorry?
From this profile, Mr. Oakes came across as the founding eminence grise behind the whole of the whole project.
No, not for Cambridge Analytica. For SCL, yes, but not for Cambridge Analytica. Cambridge Analytica was Steve Bannon, Robert Mercer, and Alexander Nix. Most of those negotiations happened in America. They kept it pretty separate from the sort of legacy shareholders and directors of SCL. Okay. But he played a pivotal role in actually setting up SCL Group. Can I
just throw the role of a couple of other people? The role of the chairman, Julian Wheatland, and Victor Cengiz,
they got rid of Cengiz when they were finalizing the Cambridge Analytica deal, because the Mercer lawyers didn't like Cengiz's involvement, because apparently he had fairly sketchy business dealings that they didn't want to be associated with.
Okay. And Julian Wheatland, what was his role?
He was, I believe, the chairman. So he didn't sort of do much. He sort of was like the queen of the company, if that makes sense.
So you
not to say that the queen doesn't do a lot. I don't interpret that as a slight of the.
You mean heads?
I'm just putting these other names up in because there's a danger that one focuses just on Mr. Nix, who's got a very sinister surname.
Yeah. So a lot of these guys, their role is not actually to do work; it's to do deals. Right? So they don't actually do anything day to day. They're the ones who, because of their family or because of their businesses or what have you, just have a very wide network of people, not just here in the UK, but in particular in Africa and various developing countries that enable the company to go and get working contracts. So their roles were usually like as the introducer, as the deal maker, not managing the day-to-day operations of the company.
Would you characterise them as people who wanted to make a fortune out of this, or people who were genuinely curious about the ability through social media in the digital age for them to be able to manipulate outcomes in politics?
You have to remember that a lot of these people are very wealthy already, so it's not, Alexander Nix in particular, right? There was one time where he had to go, and we were running late because he had to pick up a £200,000 chandelier. So he these are people who don't need to make a lot of money, but the thing that I learned is that for certain wealthy people, they need something to keep them occupied, and they need projects. And going into the developing world and sort of running a country is something that appeals to them.
Okay, and I've just got one last question. Really.
Sorry, I didn't mean that in a flippant way, if that came across as flippant. Sorry.
This chart has got no mention of Aggregate IQ or SCL Canada as it styled itself. So what's the relationship between that Canadian company and the rest of this group?
Yeah. So very shortly after I became research director at SCL, and I was sort of given the directive or the mandate to expand the company's software capacity and technological infrastructure. We obviously needed people to do that. So I reached out to people who had worked on previous projects with, who I respected. One of those people was Jeff Sylvester, who is now the CTO of Aggregate IQ. So in the first email that I sent, which I've also passed on to the committee, I've passed on several folders of documents. The first email where I tell Jeff that I've just become research director, this is what we do, his immediate reaction is, you need a Canadian office. So he replied, you need a Canadian office. When I went to Alexander Nix and I said, there's a couple Canadians that I want to hire, he said, fine, but they have to come here and work in London. So when I talked with Jeff and several other people who then later became AIQ, they had new families, just got a house. It's not easy to just get up and move to a different country when you have young kids, right? So I went back to Alexander and said, look, they're not mobile, but I think they'd be really helpful because they're really good at what they do. So the compromise was that a Canadian company would be set up that would enable the Canadians who wanted to work on the projects, and keep in mind at the time this is SCL, this is before Cambridge Analytica got set up. So primarily we were focused on projects in the developing world. But the deal was that they would sign an intellectual property license whereby all of the work that they were doing for the company would then be assigned to SCL Group, and that they would trade as SCL Canada, but they set up a Canadian entity, and that the legal name was Aggregate IQ. That was also in part because, when you work in a lot of countries, sometimes it's beneficial to have different, billing names on invoices, and if you're working in a country that has declarable expenses and all of that,
sure,
you can.
All right, so you were watching the live coverage of the proceedings before a British Parliamentary committee where Cambridge Analytica's whistleblower, Christopher Wiley, is deposing before the committee as we speak. And just to bring our viewers up to speed with all that has transpired in the last few minutes or so, Christopher Wiley says he felt his duty as a citizen to report this unlawful activity where profiles and user data of 50 million people on Facebook were leaked by Facebook to Cambridge Analytica, which in turn made use of the data to help people such as Donald Trump win the elections in the US. The activity involved psychological profiling of the users, and that he was fearful of being sued into oblivion before mustering courage to come out and claim what he did about the Cambridge Analytica's unlawful activity there. Right, we'll still these visuals. I'm now joined again by my colleague Mandy Clark, who is joining us on the phone line from London. Mandy, we are still watching these visuals, live visuals, if I might add, of Christopher Wylie deposing before the DCMS Committee of the British Parliament, the Digital, Culture, Media and Sport Committee. What the big takeaways, if I were to ask you, Mandy, about what Christopher Wylie is deposing as we speak?
Well, you know, it's not going to be anything that people haven't heard before, but now he's saying it officially to an inquiry. Before, of course, we've all heard the accusation that he's put forward about Cambridge Analytica in the newspapers, but now it's on record, it's under oath, it's in front of the Parliament, and now they have the ability to really hold Cambridge Analytica into account because they have a former employee making official statements directly to the government. It's another blow for Cambridge Analytica, who have denied all wrongdoing. It's going to be quite interesting when they are facing inquiry, because Christopher Wylie, the whistleblower, has already said when they have faced previous parliamentary inquiries, they lied. He didn't tell the truth. So Alexander Nix will be on the hot seat when he goes to talk to those parliamentarians again.
Indeed, and while we are watching these live visuals coming to you from the British Parliament, where Christopher Wylie is deposing as we speak before a committee of the British Parliament, Mandy, in fact, Damien Collins, the Conservative lawmaker who heads this committee, had a very pointed question to ask of Wylie. He asked Christopher, did the Trump election win cross the line, so to speak, for Christopher Wylie? Probably, which is why he decided to come out in the open about his claims, to which Christopher Wylie gave a very interesting answer. He says it's not just about Trump's victory. This has a much wider impact. And he goes on to say that the military-style operation is not conducive for democratic societies anywhere in the world. Your thoughts, Mandy?
Yeah, it's a very interesting notion. And he also explained it like thus. If I have an opinion, I can go into a public space and then I can give you my opinion. And then it's up to you to decide if you agree or disagree. But he says this is psychological warfare. It's like me whispering into your ear and you start to believe it's your own thoughts. And that's much darker. So people aren't even aware they're being influenced. And that's how dangerous it is to the democratic process. So it's a very legitimate concern. And we've seen psychological warfare as a use in a military campaign, not in a democratic process. You know, people don't know what to believe or whether their ideas are their own. And that's what he's saying is the dangerous element to what Cambridge Analytica has been doing.
Indeed, and as Mandy Clark was mentioning there, Christopher Wylie also says in his deposition that Cambridge Analytica did actually indeed indulge in psychometric inventories and psychological profiling of people using the online data, to which a lawmaker had this question to ask of him: does this resemble anything like an evil organization that one sees in James Bond movies? To which Christopher Wylie said this is more sinister than anyone would have ever thought. If I can come back to you, Mandy, how do democratic societies, pluralistic societies such as the UK or India for that matter, combat this challenge? Do people like you and me go off Facebook and social media, or do you think governments should impose more privacy, stringent privacy laws, especially on social media companies and technology companies such as Facebook or Twitter?
Well, I think that is now the big question: what to do. You know, it's kind of like a Pandora's box. This has been exposed to the public. It's proved to work. So even if you and I go off Facebook, you know, they will just find other ways to reach us. So it's understanding the threat, being cynical, but knowing that it can come in different ways. Once you have a proven technology, people will still find other ways to use it to gain influence, because ultimately if they can influence the vote, they can control who's in government and have power, and that's a very, very tempting prize. So it would be highly surprising if the companies walk away from this technology, because it's proven to be so powerful. It's knowing how to prevent it and being a bit more aware is the best that the average person can do at the minute.
Right, Mandy, we'll keep coming back to you as the day progresses. Christopher Wylie is still speaking, as I mentioned before, in the British Parliament, where he is deposing before a select committee of the British parliamentarians on what exactly transpired in the Facebook data breach that has taken the world by storm. And on the subject of Facebook, as Facebook finds itself in a soup over allegations of data breach, we at WION ask you if you have lost your trust in tech companies following the scandal. Find us on Twitter, look up our handle called WION News and participate in the poll on the page.